Hello and welcome to the Drexel interview. I'm your host, Paula Morantz-Cohn, speaking to you from the Smithsonian Castle in Washington, D.C. Today my guest is G. Wayne Clough, Secretary of the Smithsonian Institution. This makes him Commander-in-Chief of the world's largest museum and research complex. The Smithsonian encompasses 19 museums and galleries, 20 libraries, and the National Zoo, as well as research centers all over the country devoted to subjects ranging from astrophysics to tropical fish. Dr. Clough holds a PhD in civil engineering. Prior to coming to the Smithsonian, he was president of the Georgia Institute of Technology. We are here with him at his office in the institution's administrative headquarters inside the Smithsonian Castle on the Washington Mall. Dr. Clough, welcome to the Drexel interview.
Thank you, Paula. Glad to see you.
The Smithsonian is the largest museum in the world located here in Washington, D.C. Yet it was founded by a bequest from an Englishman. Could you tell us a little bit about him and why he chose to develop a museum here in Washington?
Well, he's an interesting person, and we don't quite know everything about him, so there's a little bit of a mystery left in that picture. But he was a prominent chemist in England. He was a man of the Enlightenment. He went to, although he got a degree at Oxford, he was a little felt stultified there because Enlightenment really hadn't hit the Oxford. So he went to Edinburgh, where a lot was going on, and studied chemistry. And he became a very prominent chemist, particularly in mineralogy. He was looking for commercial uses of mineral. He was very early on elected to the Royal Philosophic Society, which is this distinction that you get if you really rise to the prominence in your field. He traveled a lot. He was a very curious man and traveled around the world. He was very interested in what was going on in the world. And so he was particularly intrigued by the American experiment. He particularly admired Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin. Benjamin Franklin, of course, both of whom lived in England, lived in France at the same time as Smithson. And he was intrigued by them not only because of their outlook about the Enlightenment, but because they were very interested in science. Benjamin Franklin, people forget, when he was 40, quit being a printer and became a scientist full-time. Discovered the Gulf Stream and invented bifocals and many other things. And so he was fascinated that Benjamin Franklin could be involved at such a high level in governmental activities and diplomatic activities, at the same time maintaining his interest in science. And Thomas Jefferson, people forget, also had a great interest in science. He was called Mr. Mammoth by some of his friends because of his propensity to collect fossils. And he was president of the American Philosophical Society for many years, even when he was president.
And we actually have some of his fossils, I should say, at the Academy of Natural Sciences.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so we think because of his interest in these two individuals and our form of government, and the fact that he believed that that was going to be the wave of the future, that he left his entire fortune to our country. He wrote his will in 1826, and about the time Thomas Jefferson when he was dying. But he wrote his will then. Nobody knew about it until he died. Smithson died in 1829. And then we discovered he had left his money to the United States to create an institution for the diffusion and increase of knowledge in the nation's capital with one stipulation, and one stipulation only, that it be named after him.
Okay, well, that's a logical stipulation. But that's so inspiring in a way. I mean, it does give us a sense of how America was viewed at that time as the great experiment, as you say.
Yes.
And this is such an extraordinary research as well as, exhibition.
I think Mr. Smithson will be happy today if he knew what we've become.
Could you tell us when was it actually begun? You say the actual will was written in the 1820s?
1826.
And then the institution itself began at what date?
Well, we really didn't get the money until about 1836, English courts being what they were in those days. And the money was left to Congress. And I joke a little bit about that. So most of us today wouldn't leave our money to Congress, but he did. And so it took a while. He had to go through the deliberative process even of that day. And fortunately, John Quincy Adams, who had been president, but came back and was reelected as a congressman, took this on as a cause. And so by 1846, he had convinced his colleagues to create this grand institution. And he basically divvied up the governance into the three bodies that legislate and control our futures here in the United States. The judicial branch, the legislative branch, and the executive branch. And so the Chancellor of the Smithsonian is the Chief Justice of the United States. So I report personally to John Roberts, who's presently the Chief Justice. And then the Vice President's the Vice Chancellor. And then we have 3 members of the Senate, 3 members of the House, and 9 private citizens on our governing board.
Now, in between that time, when it was founded, I guess in the 1840s?
1846.
1846. And now, is there a juncture, a period that to you was very pivotal in terms of bringing the Smithsonian to the point where it is today?
Well, I think first and foremost it was founded on the right basis, and they hired Joseph Henry as the first secretary, who came from Princeton, who was a self-taught scientist and engineer. Anybody from Drexel would appreciate the fact that this was a sort of a Renaissance man, actually. And he believed in research and scholarship, and that first and foremost the institution should be about research and scholarship, not so much about collections. And he did not think the Smithsonian should ever have a museum. He kind of missed on that one. But his idea was to build up collections for research and scholarship. And so that was basically the fundamental reason for the Smithsonian to exist was research and scholarship. And that is carried forward whether we have art museums, history museums, or science museums. It's all about science and research throughout the Smithsonian. And that scholarship then imbues the Smithsonian with what it really is today.
This research element, which I think a lot of people, when they think about the Smithsonian, they do not realize the degree to which the institution is involved in research. Can you tell us a little bit about some of the more salient areas in which research is being carried on, both here in Washington and I guess elsewhere as well?
Right. Well, we are active in 130 different countries, and we have physical locations outside of the United States. As a good example of that is the Smithsonian Tropical Research Institution in Panama. And we have 400 people there, and their primary function is to study the natural world, particularly in the tropical and temperate forest areas around the world. So this is a very intensely oriented research activity. Even in our museums, the great Natural History Museum, which is one of the world's largest natural history museums here on the Mall, they have 400 research scientists who work all over the world in anthropology, biology, paleontology, archaeology, anthropology, and so forth. And their collections are research-based collections. And so they have a huge research collection that they do research themselves, but also they invite people in to do research. And today that research has gone to leading edge research, because you can take a collection that in some ways was obtained 130, 150 years ago, but today you can use genomics to study these collections in a whole different way.
That's interesting. So now with these new tools, the collections take on a new kind of significance, the DNA kind
And they're
of
available
research.
to scholars anywhere in the world. And as we digitize more and more of them, people can actually access them relatively easily through digital means, in some cases rather than having to come here. But any given year we have several thousand scientists who visit with the Smithsonian, visit our collections, or visit our facilities like the Tropical Research Institution to carry out their activity. Now, in addition to the sciences, of course, this whole fundamental of research and scholarship carried over as we developed the art, history, and culture side of the Smithsonian. And if you were to go to the Freer-Sackler Museum today, it's fascinating to me to go down into their collections with the scholars, say, on the Japanese collections, the print collections, and go to one of these collections and see what they know about, the incredible knowledge they have about these prints and how they take care of them so they will be here forever. And to me, it's just fascinating to see this depth of scholarship, because that informs the exhibitions and all the educational materials that we deliver to people.
So some of the research has to do with things like preservation and maintenance. And I know this issue of 3D imaging is very hot right now. You even have a 3D sculpture of yourself or something of the sort. Tell us a little bit about that. I think that's still, for the general audience, that's still something relatively new to us.
Well, certainly the basis for that goes back to what you said first, and that is this conservation ethic. That we have the Museum Conservation Institute, which is out in Maryland, which is almost unique in all of the world. And as an engineer, I particularly feel at home there. I go in a room and there are these PhD scientists in just about every material in the world, because we have plastics, we have textiles, we have skins from Native American collections, and we have wood, you name it. And we have to be able to take care of all, and even spacesuits, we have to take care of all these things. So we have the top scientists in the world in conservation. Now the next step in a lot of our work is to go to imaging of these collections. And you can image them for a number of purposes. One is so people can see them, because basically you own our collections. You help pay for them because you're a taxpayer. And so our objective is to get more of this material out for the people who are just interested in general, but also for teachers and students and lifelong learners to be able to access these things. Now the 3D part of it is the next and most exciting part of it, and we've really worked hard over the last few years to build up our capability in this area, because that's where it's all going. And we have some of the very best people in the world.
It's interesting to me to hear you talk. You obviously get excited by the research that's going on. Well, you were the president of a university.
Yes.
You were at a research university, a major research university, and I wonder how it differs. I mean, this is a humongous site with so many different components to it. But are there areas of overlap, and what are the areas of overlap and divergence from what it was like to be the president of a university versus that of being at an institution of this size?
Well, I think there are similarities and differences. It took me a while to sort of sort that out in my own mind. But the fundamentals of research and scholarship are exactly the same, because everyone is really trying to discover new knowledge, and then you want to share it with people, and that's really the fundamental of it. And so our scientists and our scholars here would if you listen to them, you'll say those are the same people that you're familiar with at Drexel and other great universities. The difference here will be the topic matters. We are interested in some things that other people are not interested. We run the National Zoo, and we're very interested in the 2,000 magnificent animals that we have in the zoo. But our effort there is to say, if you're going to have animals at a zoo for people to see and love, you also have to be working to save those animals in the wild. And so we have a major research effort that lies behind that. So not too many people have a zoo. Not too many people have collections with 137 million objects in it.
Yeah.
And so a lot of our research can be collections based. Now, in that sense, we serve as a national lab, because anybody can use these collections. And so part of our work really is to provide the basis for other scholars to come in. So we have multiple partnerships with universities because of this similarity, and in some places where we have things and objectives and items that we have that universities don't have, it's great to partner with them. And universities have things. I don't have a College of Engineering here. And so there are places where I want to do things in three-dimensional imaging where it's better for me to partner with industry, partner with universities in order to get the work done. Nobody can do it all by themselves today, no matter how big you are. You really need others if you're going to get your objectives accomplished in this very multidisciplinary world that we live in.
So has that been one of your missions, of finding the right partners for the right projects, so to speak? I mean, you mentioned universities, there's also NASA. I don't know what other areas, what other institutions are brought in. How do you go about deciding who to partner with and making those connections? There must be lots of red tape. It's a big institution, and I imagine there's red tape.
It is. Well, I think that the best way to do that is sort of a twofold approach, sort of top down and bottoms up. So you want to give some guidance from the top. That is, what is the strategic objectives? What are the broad areas that we want to focus on for the future? But bottoms up, you have to have equals working with equals. Yeah. If there's a faculty member in a university who is working in a field but doesn't want to work with our folks, that's not going to work. You have to find people who want to work together. And so it has to be a bottoms up and a top-down type approach. So for us, we developed a new kind of strategic plan to get at this very issue. We had 1,500 people involved. We had people from universities and others working with us in developing our strategic plan to define our 4 grand challenges, and then the areas where we saw cross-cutting research in between those where we could work with others. A good example of that, we had for a long time observed forests around the world. I mentioned the Tropical Research Institution has done that for us. And then we decided, well, we should be doing that in the oceans, but we can't do that by ourselves. So we're working with NOAA, we're working with NASA, we're working with Scripps, we're working with Woods Hole, and many of the Sea Grant universities that want to work with us in setting up an observatory network for the coastal oceans, the close-in ocean issues where so many of the problems exist. And so we'll monitor long-term and explain what's going on to everyone in these environments. But you can't do that by yourself. You've got to do that with others.
Now, has this involved also looking into issues of climate change?
Absolutely. Climate change, we like to call it global change because for us, if we're looking at, say, endangered species, climate change is certainly one of the factors that's influencing what's going on with us, as well as with the animals and mammals and others that occupy the planet with us. But it's also environmental change. And
now,
sometimes those are linked.
How does that connect with the political issues that obviously have an impact on an institution that's so much funded by the government, where you do have ideological positions that oppose certain views?
Well,
How have you dealt with that?
these are areas that can be a little bit tension-filled, if you will, but that's the way it's always been. Because even when Joseph Henry was here, there was this little subject called evolution that was coming along, and he had to write extensively on why evolution was important and why it was important for the Smithsonian to be in the forefront of studying. He was a big supporter of Darwin. And so it's not a new thing for the Smithsonian to go into these areas. From our point of view, what we try to do is to be the honest broker. Our objective, for example, on climate change, as I mentioned, is to make observations.
Right.
And from these observations, we'll tell people, here's what we know. And we know this because we have observed it. Now, we can make projections, but we can also make projections by looking backwards. For example, 55 million years ago was a period of enormous warming that went on in the planet. And we now know a lot about why that happened. What were the triggers? How did it move from one stage to the next? What were the different carbon sources and so forth? These things can happen under natural environments as well as environments where man is having an impact on these things. And so we see our job as I say, an honest broker, to try to tell people as best we can what we know from multiple points of view. And so on climate change, we can tell you, for example, because we have a migratory bird center, that bird migration patterns are changing dramatically because of warming. We know that. We know that to be a fact. We study fish and wildlife and reefs and crabs in Chesapeake Bay. All of these are being impacted by acidification of the ocean, and that's occurring because much more carbon is in the air. And when that happens, we also study forest, and we know that carbon in some ways actually encourages forest growth. And we want to understand that as well, and we're seeing that. And so from these observations, we try to help people understand the issues that they're going to have to deal with.
Let's shift to the museums themselves, which people are so interested in. You know, when people come to Washington, they come to the Smithsonian. They generally go to the National Gallery. I'm talking about my family now, but I think people I know. The Portrait Gallery, the Air and Space Museum, the museum, the American History Museum. Those four. But there's so many more.
Right.
Could you tell us a little bit about the difficulties, perhaps, as an administrator, juggling the needs of museums that are perhaps less well-known and less visited, but that might require more maintenance than, I don't know, that more than the Air and Space Museum. Nothing could, possibly. But some of those sorts of tricky issues of allocation and so forth.
Well, we have a variety of museums, and they're all lovely and fantastic places. And we try to manage our resources to do the best job we can to keep them in top shape as best we can. That is a challenge because those resources are becoming more constrained. But so part of our objective is not only to manage the museums, but their collections, right? Because those are twofold responsibilities you have. But we have small museums, for example, the National Postal Museum, which is over near Union Station, was just renovated. And it is a magnificent, state-of-the-art gallery for stamps. If you are a philatelist, as
my father-in-law would love that, I have to tell him.
And if you love stamps, this is the place to go. It is the best gallery, thanks to gift from a donor, William Gross, the great bond investor. He is amazing what people are philatelists and love stamps. And he is one of those. So donors can help us build up our capacity to show these wonderful resources. The Air and Space Museum, everybody loves that. They have a tremendous board that is extremely generous. We built the entire museum out at Dulles Airport, the second one, using private funds. We're building an African American History and Culture Museum. Congress gave us half the money. We are raising the other half. And so we understand as a trust, that's what we were established as, that we can do things others can't. So our objective is to manage our dual sets of resources in ways to get the work done that's necessary for the American people.
Well, also the architecture here is so diverse, and that must be another challenge, both in terms of renovation and maintenance and so forth.
Right.
Could you tell us a little bit about some of the highlights or some perhaps buildings that people don't know as much about that you think have a history or, an interest architecturally
Sure.
that you'd want to let us know about?
Well, every building on the mall has an interesting architectural history, and sometimes they're very complex. And what you see is not what it started out as. Most of the buildings have been added on to multiple times. Natural history has been added on to 3 or 4 times. And so many of the buildings have evolved over time. This building, the castle, is not what it started out to be. It's been, the piece actually we're sitting in was added on to vertically. And so it's changed dramatically over time. The building that's next door would be to my left, and to your right is the Arts and Industries building. And it used to be called the National Museum because that was the only museum building the Smithsonian had at the time in 1881. And Adolph Clough was a great architect. He's called the Red Brick Architect here in Washington. And he did some magnificent buildings, most of which have been torn down, sadly. Only about 5 are left. But this
Of the red brick.
Of the red brick, of his specialty. And this building was a magnificent piece of architecture, but in addition, it was a technological wonder for its time because it didn't have any electricity.
Oh.
And so he designed it so it would be entirely ventilated by natural circulation, and in fact, you would not need any lighting other than the lighting you could get from nature. And so he has clear stories around the top of the building, and that building has been closed for 8 years, and we've been working for the last 3 or 4 in renovating it and going back to Clough's idea of opening it up with these magnificent arches so you can see through it and you can use natural lighting, just as he said. I was over there the other day giving someone a tour. It happened to be an overcast day like today, but suddenly the sun came through and you could see exactly what Clough wanted to do because the sun just streamed into those magnificent clear stories and all the windows that he has there.
Any museum now has a push and a pull attached to it. On the one hand, the desire to have cutting-edge, advanced sorts of exhibits that really push the envelope, so to speak.
Right.
On the other hand, you are beholden to people, to donors, and in this case, to the federal government for a large portion of your, $1 billion budget. Tell us a little bit about negotiating that tricky sort of balance.
Well, I think first, the good news is, 99% of the people love the Smithsonian. They may not quite know what it is. It's one of the things we've learned in our branding work, that the Smithsonian brand we know from other studies that have been done is one of the most admired brands in all the world. You can't go almost anywhere in the world and say the name Smithsonian and someone doesn't have a positive thought about this great institution. But very few people know what it is we do. So part of our job deals with, as you pointed out, communications. And so we have to be able to communicate to all of our stakeholders. And that is the federal government, that's Congress. Remember, we report to all 3 branches of the government. And in addition, we have to communicate with our donors and the people who come visit us. So we have been working hard to have more people come and visit because we have more capacity to share. And since I've been here, we've increased by about 5 million the number of visitors who come here. We're up to over 31 million visitors last year, which is a stunning number. I know the Louvre gets 10 million, and I know I'm proud of that. But the Smithsonian gets over 31 million visits a year.
That's impressive.
And it's gone up. People want to come here. They want to see the real thing. They want to do it with their families. They want to look at the Star Spangled Banner like I do and just feel the hair on the back of your neck stand up. That's what it's all about. So that's part of it. And also the thing that a lot of people understand is our push to share things digitally. That both come together. We've had 60 million more people visiting our websites over the last 3 years. So people really want what we have digitally. There are people who can't get here every year. And they'd still like to stay in touch with the Smithsonian, and we can let them stay in touch. We have 100 new exhibitions a year. And some people tell me, well, I haven't been to the Smithsonian in 5 years, but I haven't missed much. I said, well, you missed 500 exhibitions. So you can now see those things digitally, but come as often as you can, because that's a very special experience. And so you have to communicate those things to Congress, and that's what our strategic plan did. It was a device that was one that would help us communicate this complex institution to people so they could see what it is it does.
Well, we don't have much time left. I know that you have announced your retirement for next year.
Yes.
And I wonder what advice you would give to your successor, having spent, I guess, how long, 7 years? 5
this
years?
I'm in my 6th year.
Your 6th year.
Yeah, but I will say this has been a gift in my stage of life. You know, I had a wonderful academic career as a faculty member. I loved being a teacher and doing research.
Yeah.
And then I sort of fell into administration and did reasonably well at that, and loved being at Georgia Tech, which was my alma mater, undergraduate alma mater.
Oh.
And then I was going to retire then. And so I flunked retirement. I was asked to come here, and it's been a gift to be here. I would like to think that the next person who comes in, you know, understands again the depth of research and scholarship that drive this institution. And I like to think that I leave this institution in better shape. The next person has plenty of work to do, but I think we've left it in much better shape for them.
When you feel stressed or you have a desire to relax, is there an artifact or a painting or a place that you tend to like to go?
Well, I like to do 2 things. One, I like to walk on the mall and see the kids. And watch them smile. That makes me feel good. Then the other thing I often do is, and I just did this last week, is when when we started up a new exhibition, I love to go through the exhibition with the curator, because the curator tells me so many things that I would not have known otherwise. We have a grand new exhibition on the Latino influence on American art. And Carmen Ramos is a fabulous new curator. And I had the opportunity, the honor to walk around with Carmen, and she explained why she picked each one of those paintings. And I never would have thought about it in the way she thought about it.
Secretary Clough, I want to thank you so much for being here and talking to us.
Thank you, Paula. It's a pleasure.
Yeah. And thank you for being with us today at the Drexel interview.